What is biomimicry?
Well, biomimicry is the idea of looking to nature as a source of inspiration for design solutions. And, the truth is that there are some amazing examples that we can find in nature that we can learn from. And if I give you one example, so this is a type of shell, it's called abalone. And if you look at that under a powerful microscope, you'll find that it's made up out of layers of calcium carbonate, which are connected together with a flexible protein. And that gives it amazing strength. So at a chemical level, it's almost identical to ordinary blackboard chalk. But because of that microstructure, it's about 3,000 times as strong. And so we can learn from ideas like that to make designs for houses that look roughly like this, which is based on the same sort of ideas. And by doing that, we can learn to make buildings that use a fraction of the material. And there are loads of different examples of things we can learn from in biology: efficient structures, better materials, even ways of getting water out of the air in deserts.
Yeah, I mean, it's actually just, I'm sort of slightly distracted by the structure that's actually right behind you. So that's, if you could sort of explain what that is, because that looks like a really great example of what we talk about here.
Yeah, sure. So this is a table that we designed for an exhibition, and it's based on ideas from tree and bone growth patterns. So we were trying to get as close as possible to a kind of perfect structure, by which I mean using the absolute minimum of material to achieve what we wanted, which was to create this sort of table that we could display stuff on. And compared to, say, a solid block of that shape, this uses about 1/1000th of the material, and is 3D printed from a biologically derived polymer. So essentially that's taking carbon out of the atmosphere and then building with it in a, I think, beautiful and very efficient way.
Yeah, I mean, it does look really stunning. I mean, do you think nature has all the answers, or is it partly that and partly your interpretation of what nature's doing into creating things that we need as humans?
Yeah, it's a really good question, because it's both, really. So humans have a capacity to invent things out of thin air, and you don't get that in biology. Things tend to just sort of improve very gradually through evolutionary refinement. But what nature does offer is the most amazing source book of ideas that have all benefited from this incredibly long and ruthless process of refinement. So everything that you see around today is an example of that refinement process that we can learn from.
Yeah, I mean, is nature itself always improving, or is it kind of one step forward, two step backwards? Is it kind of zigzagging around, or is it very reactive to the environment?
I don't think you get that many steps backwards in evolution. I mean, I guess when you have extinction events, then I guess that could be regarded as a step backwards. But generally, as species evolve over time, they become better and better adapted to their particular niche.
Is it all nature? I mean, or is it the fascination with plants or animals or birds, or, is there specific areas of nature that adopt much easier to the models you're working on?
It's in principle is all of it. So, for instance, one example I use quite often in talks is of a type of mycelium. So there was this experiment done in Japan. The scientists got a map of the region around Tokyo, and then they put a little source of food on each of the cities around Tokyo on this map, and then they put what's called a slime mold on Tokyo itself, and the slime mold spread out. It located all those sources of food and then started optimizing the connections between them. And when it had finished, that network exactly matched the railway layout in that part of Japan, except that the railway engineers had taken thousands of hours to arrive at that optimization, whereas the slime mold did it in just 26 hours.
I mean, that's really a fantastic piece of thinking outside the box, or the Petri dish or whatever, isn't it?
Absolutely.
I mean, what was your route to this? I mean, your background, I think, if I'm right in saying, you're interested in nature and design as well, weren't you, initially?
That's right. So as a teenager, I was passionate about three things: design, biology, and the environment. And I couldn't really see the connections between those back then. So I thought about studying biology, but ultimately I didn't see how that could be particularly creative. I mean, I was completely wrong there. But anyway, I went and studied architecture. And then some years later, I had an opportunity to work on the Eden project. So that was when I was 30. I joined in the quite early stages. And that's when I really saw the potential to bring together these three strands of design, biology, and the environment.
I mean, what was it about specifically about the Eden projects that brought in these strands? I mean, was it the way it's set up, the actual basic idea of the Eden project, sort of toys around all those kind of themes, or do they just give you kind of a carte blanche to actually do something really out of the box?
Well, I was working with an amazing team, and many of them were also into biomimicry. And so the client was a really inspiring guy called Tim Schmidt, and the brief he gave us was fairly open. He just wanted this to be, well, I think he described it had to be the eighth wonder of the world. But apart from that, and wanting to have quite a James Bond quality to it, he gave us quite an open brief. And so we played about with computer models of the site itself and conceived of the building as like a string of spheres. And the way those were strung together, we varied. We tried different versions and syncing those into this 3D model of the site. And eventually we arrived at what we felt was the best arrangement, so that it would actually benefit from what we call passive solar gain. So essentially, we were making the most of the south-facing slopes so that during the day, it could absorb the sun's heat. And so to a large extent, it would be a self-heating building. And actually, when you go there, even in winter, when the sun comes out, pretty soon, the top vents have to open because it's that effective at absorbing all that free energy.
I mean, it's the eco aspect of it. Obviously, it's very urgent now. But was this initial important part of this process? Or was initially like biomimicry itself, maybe before you got involved in it, just about the fascination of structures that are in nature and how to adopt them into like human structures? And has the eco bit gradually been added on as we moved into a more desperate kind of era?
Yeah, I reckon it's always been both. Actually, I think we've always had a kind of innate love of the natural world. So it is partly about getting closer to nature. And then I think it's also always been at least partly about efficiency. So for instance, in Florence, the dome over the cathedral, at the time that was built in the Renaissance, that was the largest dome in the world by quite a long way. And the architect learned how to do that by looking at bird shells and seashells. And so that by doing that, he was able to make the thinnest possible shell and the largest overall dome.
Yeah, yes, because it's quite a deep history to this, isn't it? This is, I mean, obviously copying things in nature, people have been doing it for hundreds of years, haven't they? But it's only recently become more of, do we call it a science? Is it?
Well, it's a design discipline based on science, I would say. And the huge advantage we have now is that we've got amazing scientific knowledge. So back then, I'm thinking back in the Renaissance times, it was based on a fairly limited understanding of what was going on. But now we have vastly superior scientific knowledge and actually much better ways of making things as well. So for instance, this is a model we made of an enlarged section from a bird skull, and that's 3D printed. And 3D printing is a fantastic technology because it allows us to get closer to the quite complicated shapes that you find in biology. But when I say complicated, that's evolved to put the material exactly where it needs to be. So it's incredibly materially efficient. And conventionally, that used to be more expensive. Anything that was complicated, it meant more input and more expense and so on. But now, with 3D printing, in principle, it could be cheaper because you'll be using less material.
It's interesting you say that, when I'm looking at that, the idea of it being more complex. You think sometimes there's a tendency for humans to put that much more rigid, the structure, so they'd be like little parallel pillars. in that bird skull, whereas that they're kind of like one's like that and one's like that. They're all different angles, but it's perfect, isn't it? But do we sometimes iron out what we perceive as imperfections?
Yeah. So sometimes what looks a little bit accidental in biological structures, well, very often there is a reason to that. There is some kind of advantage that it gives. I'm not exactly sure in this case what the advantage is from those irregularities, but normally there is some kind of a reason to it.
I mean, what would you use something like that for? What's a practical application of that piece, the bird skull piece?
Well, we designed an office building using biomimicry. So we had a fantastic client who just wanted us to use biomimicry throughout the whole process. So we divided the design challenge up into separate functional challenges. And for the floors, we were just trying to use the minimum possible material. And so we looked at examples like bird skulls and also cuttlebone, the bone in a cuttlefish. That's another one that has really quite an amazing structure. So again, quite complicated, but putting the material exactly where it needs to be so that you save a lot on those materials. And in that office building, we were able to achieve a saving of about 40% on the structure. We were able to design the glass facade with about half the amount of glass and about 70% less aluminium. So there are big advantages just in resource terms, but also in terms of human well-being. By designing that building so that it was almost entirely naturally lit, we were providing a much healthier quality of light for the people that will work inside it.
Yeah, I think you talked about that, the event in Lancaster.
That's right, yes.
Yeah, it's amazing. I've seen it on the internet as well, the building. I mean, the light thing idea as well. I mean, where's that coming from nature? Was that from forest canopies? I can't quite remember where the light ideas came from.
There were quite a lot of examples we looked at actually of how light is gathered and distributed in biology. So one thing we looked at is the eye of a spookfish. So a spookfish is a really bizarre ocean creature that has these mirror structures which are able to focus very low levels of light coming up from the ocean, bioluminescence essentially, and focus that onto its retina. We also looked at a plant that lives in deserts called a stone plant, and a type of starfish called a brittle star, which has lenses over its skin. And then one that we looked at in more detail was a plant that lives in rainforests, in the rainforest floor, where light levels are really quite low. And somehow it has evolved lenses over its leaves, which are able to focus diffuse light, which is really quite challenging because diffuse light, it comes from all different directions, but somehow it does manage to achieve a degree of focusing of that.
I mean, how do you know about all these animals and plants? You do a really deep dive into nature, or is it just? I mean, do you spend hours on Wikipedia, like, or is it like a team? Do you have like the French nature team?
I used to be a bit like that, so I would read a lot of science magazines and just developed a really good kind of radar for these ideas. But there are two things that have made it much easier. One is working with biologists, and I've found some that are really good to work with, with encyclopedic knowledge. And then there are also some quite good online resources. There's a brilliant one called asknature.org, where you can tap in a particular challenge, like how would nature make foundations in loose ground or something, and it comes up with a number of examples that you can look at, and by understanding how it works in biology, that often inspires new ways of doing it for what we need.
I mean, looking at all this stuff and dredging through all this information, are there actually any blind spots that nature has? You think, wow, nature hasn't worked this out yet, or is everything actually covered?
There are, but perhaps fewer than you might think. So an example I sometimes give in lectures, when people say to me, well, nature's all right, but you don't get jumbo jets or high-speed rotating axles or whatever. Well, high-speed rotating axles, sure, you don't find those in biology. But there's an insect called a wood wasp, which has on the back of its abdomen, it has a thing called an ovipositor, and this is a kind of drill bit that can drill into wood, and it lays its eggs in wood. And rather than make it something that rotates, it's in two halves, which kind of move back and forth like that, and they've got ridges on them. So it pushes this into a crack in the wood, and then it can pull on one side, and it just kind of works its way into the wood with virtually no pushing force. And that has been turned into an idea for a medical drill that can drill into really sensitive locations, like into a skull, but without any pushing force. And what's more, because it's in two halves, it can follow a curved path. And so by taking inspiration from nature, it's resulted in a solution that is arguably better than we would have been able to come up with by just conventional invention.
So in a sense, the blind spots are really our blind spots. Nature's already one step ahead.
In many ways, yeah, that's right.
So after the Eden project, that was your first break into doing a big project with these kind of ideas. Where did you go next?
Well, I worked with that company, Grimshaw, for 10 years. So I worked on the later phases of the Eden project and quite a few other projects there where we were pushing ideas of progressive sustainability and drawing on ideas from biomimicry. And then I got to the point where I was convinced that I just wanted to focus entirely on biomimicry. So I left on very good terms and set up my own company called Exploration, which gave me the opportunity to really focus on this area. And that's what I've been doing ever since, really.
What does biomimicry bring to our sustainability? I mean, obviously nature is pretty good at sustainability because it sustains itself for billions of years, probably sustain itself a lot better if we weren't here. So, I mean, what does biomimicry, bring to the ideas of sustainability, and for our futures?
Well, I've talked quite a bit already about much more efficient ways of doing things. But now I think we're at a really crucial point in history because it's become clear that conventional sustainability is not enough because very often it's just been based on trying to be a bit less bad. And it's also tended to be just based on humans. And we need to expand that to include all life forms because actually our long-term well-being is inseparable from the health of the ecosystems on which we depend. And that particularly came home during the pandemic. If we keep disrupting ecosystems, we're likely to experience more frequent and potentially more serious pandemics. And so biomimicry is, I think, one of the best solutions for how we go beyond conventional sustainability into the realm of what's increasingly being referred to as regenerative design. And so this is trying to actually have a net positive impact. So rather than just being a bit less bad, we're actually trying to have a positive impact across a whole range of measures.
Is that part of the thinking behind the project in the Sahara deserts?
Yeah, sure. So the Sahara Forest Project, it was partly about creating food and clean energy in hot parts of the world. And then it was also about revegetating deserts. And it might surprise some people to hear that actually a lot of what is desert now around the world is only a fairly recent thing. So for instance, the large parts of what is now the Sahara was covered in cedar trees and cypress trees until Julius Caesar and his armies got there. And they cut those forests down to create an intensive farm. And pretty soon they had substantially trashed the landscape. So we were trying to work away from the edges and reverse that process of desertification.
I mean, what does biomimicry bring to a project like that? Is it trying to find plants that are efficient in growing in a desert environment to, basically take root and create the foundations of like an ecosystem?
Well, there are quite a few things you can turn to. So one of the interesting things about extreme environments is that you'll often find really clever adaptations to those environments. So for instance, in deserts, you can find a type of beetle that can get water out of the air. I talked about that in my TED talk. If you think of a classic cactus, the prickly pear, if you look at the dots on the leaves of a prickly pear, those are clusters of spines, very little fine spines, and those have a particular geometry to them, which helps draw droplets of water out of the air. The droplets form on the ends and they track along those spines up into the body of the cactus. And another one that I've looked at and designed a project based on is camel's nostrils, believe it or not. Camel's nostrils are miracles of water recovery engineering. They recover nearly all of the moisture from the air. As it breathes out, a camel really can't afford to lose much water. So its nostrils have evolved into these very elaborate passageways that recapture that.
And these are all adopted into the buildings you put in the desert, or into the structure of, what would be there for the plants to grow on?
Well, a bit of both. So with that last one, we turned that into an idea for a pavilion for the one of the expos. And the idea was that the roof structure would actually harvest moisture from the air and then use that to supply an oasis garden of rare and special plants underneath.
And how far have you got this project? I saw some pictures online, and it looked good, sort of snaking its way through the deserts, but it was hard to tell if it's at the beginning or if it was halfway through.
Yeah, well, the Sahara Forest project, we built a version in Qatar, and that was opened during the climate change talks in Doha. And that was a test facility. So we operated that, and it worked extremely well. We grew crops with half the amount of fresh water throughout the summer months. We tested all the different elements of the system and refined those, and also monitored what we had achieved in terms of desert revegetation. We then took that forward to a larger scale in Jordan, and then we're hoping that is still going to scale up.
I mean, what's the end point of that? Is this still an experimental stage, or would the end game, obviously not within 12 months, but would the end game to actually recreate the cedar forests that were there before Julius Caesar?
Well, ideally, yes. We hope that we'll be able to grow crops in arid regions, as well as improving food, water, and energy security. And what I mean by that is that when people run short of food, water, or energy, it can produce conflict. And so trying to avoid that, the term that's normally used is food, water, or energy security. And Jordan is quite a critical example there. It's one of the most water poor countries in the world. They import a lot of their energy and a lot of their food, and it's got one or two quite tricky neighbors, and it'd be easy to see how that region could descend into conflict. So what I think is much better than investing in military solutions once things have gone wrong is much better to invest in clever solutions that prevent those problems occurring.
So I mean, so for an endpoint for a country like Jordan is the water it has, what little water it has. It can recycle it endlessly to create the food and the nutrition, basically, that what it actually needs.
That's right. Yeah.
I mean, it's a lot of these ideas that you're working on there, would they adopt back into cities, say in Europe? Would you be able to adopt some of the ideas you're working on there into models for like Manchester, where I am now, or London?
Yeah, absolutely. And one of the, I think, most exciting opportunities for cities is to start thinking of them as being like ecosystems. So in an ecosystem, you have lots of different species with interconnections between them. And the waste from one species is nearly always the input for something else in that system. So it's a zero waste system that runs entirely on solar energy. It's very productive, and it doesn't have any toxins in it. There's no such thing as unemployment in nature. And we could start modeling urban systems on those. So if you think about ways to connect up all the food, energy, water, and waste, all the resource flows essentially in cities, instead of those being linear flows that pass through our cities and end up as waste, those could become a whole system of cyclical flows that design out the whole idea of waste, that create far more employment, that are regenerative to the landscape and to the people. It's a huge opportunity waiting to be explored.
I mean, is that as a city, taking the city as a whole unit itself, or each sort of house or flat as a sort of a micro unit within this sort of bigger ecosystem?
You can do it at a small scale, but it tends to be that at the bigger scale, there are much better opportunities. And this has been tried. It's not a completely new idea. So there's a place in Denmark called Kalundborg, and this was an industrial area where they co-located industries and they looked at opportunities for using the waste from one to be the input for something else. And they achieved massive savings in energy, water, and waste, as well as providing a lot of waste heat to the nearby town. And it's that kind of thinking that we need to explore if we're really going to make breakthroughs in addressing climate change and the planetary emergency more generally.
I like this idea of the city being an ecosystem. I also quite like it's a bit more esoteric, but the idea of the city actually being a living entity in a sense, a concrete animal or something. But I also like what you're saying here, because it's looking at the city not in a dystopian kind of way. It's actually looking at it in a sense almost positive. You've got this kind of cluster of people here and a cluster of waste here. It's actually an advantage because you can recycle it all. You've got more stuff to turn into more stuff.
Absolutely. And there are other dimensions as well. So I recently wrote a co-authored book. It's called Flourish with my co-author, Sarah Ichioka. And we talked a lot about cities here. And one of the ideas we explore, it's a tricky word, is symbiogenesis. So symbiosis is when two or more organisms evolve to kind of live together in a way for mutual benefits. And symbiogenesis refers to the way that over time, organisms that live together like that, they start evolving new structures or new ways of living that further enhance those benefits. And we could do the same in our cities. So rather than having suburban sprawl with lots of isolated buildings and very little potential for people to share amenities and so on, it suggests moving more towards a model like what's called the 15-minute city. So this is being tried in Paris, where they're refitting parts of the city to create this idea whereby people can access nearly everything they need within a 15-minute walk or cycle. And that really is transformative in a number of ways. It means that people don't need to own as many cars. It means people are fitter and healthier. There's a much greater degree of social interaction. People will tend to know more of their neighbors. And loneliness is a really serious issue for our well-being. It can take something like 10 or 15 years off your life. So with something like the 15-minute city, you bring people together in a much more beneficial way. And we also mention an idea from George Monbiot. He says that too often we tend to have private luxury and public squalor. So private luxury for a few and public squalor for the many. But it'd be perfectly possible to do the opposite. And if we had private sufficiency and public luxury, a public luxury of shared facilities, we could have created a much better quality of life for everyone with far less resources and far less energy.
Yeah, these are great ideas. I mean, the 15-minute city, in a sense, would that be like one tree in the Amazon, like a whole ecosystem within an ecosystem?
I guess you could look at it like that, yes.
I mean, what part? I mean, obviously, nature's kind of providing the framework of the ideas for this as a city, looking at the city as, like a forest, maybe, whatever. But what part does nature itself have in this? Is there space for nature? Like an urban nature, or?
Oh, sure, yeah. So one of the most inspiring models I've heard for the new regenerative city comes from a group that we've worked with in the US. They're called Biomimicry 3.8. And what they say is that when you're designing a new building or a new city, then the way you should start is by looking at how a mature ecosystem in that part of the world would function. How much oxygen would it produce, how much water would it filter, how much carbon would it sequester, how much food would it produce, how much wildlife would it accommodate. And those should become the targets for your new bit of city. We're nowhere near that at the moment, but there are enough examples of projects that do bits of that for me to be convinced that that is absolutely possible. And when we get to that point, then we could say with some confidence that we have integrated everything we do into a stable ecological system. And so that would involve quite a lot of nature in the city. So on buildings, I think we're likely to see more and more plants. There are one or two examples of this that are a bit bonkers, you know, trees up on right on the top of buildings and so on. I don't necessarily advocate that, but I think there is a good case for incorporating much more vegetation onto buildings and in the spaces between buildings. So there's a fantastic project in Seoul in South Korea. It's got a really tricky name. It's called the Khiechion River Restoration Project. So this river used to be covered with a 10-lane elevated motorway. And the mayor managed to persuade people to tear this down, they restored the river and created this beautiful linear park. So now people can walk all the way through this part of the city, you know, without traffic and congestion. It's a fantastic place for events. And it's even helped to cool that part of the city in the summer.
I mean, do you find it, I mean, obviously, because you're kind of one of the leading people in this kind of space, that a lot of cities are coming to you or speaking about these kind of ideas that would have been inconceivable in city planning even 10 years ago? Are they becoming very much parts of the palette of the 21st century city, or is it still frustrating kind of literally roadblocks everywhere?
Well, frankly, we've left it very late as a civilization. We should have been exploring these ideas 25 years ago or more. It seems now people are getting more and more interested in them. And now we're in an emergency situation. We really are. You know, there's not a single UK Prime Minister in the last 30 years that has been honest with the British people about how serious climate change is. And even the media, this isn't a dig at you, by the way, at all, but the media have been oil companies, because the oil companies knew long ago that climate change was real, man-made, and very serious. So now we're in an emergency situation, and it's going to take all hands on deck to rescue this. But I am convinced that it is possible to create a wonderful future for everyone on planet Earth, and so that we can thrive within planetary limits.
So in the sense, the short-term thinking that was there before, where it's basically kicking the can down the road, is a new type of short-term thinking where we actually have to do this now very quickly.
Yeah, well, short-term thinking is absolutely part of the kind of problematic mindset. So I'll give you one example. A little while ago, we designed a zero waste textiles factory. And so we showed that we could get all the way to zero carbon, zero waste. We could design out all the toxins and make this a fantastic working environment for the people inside. And we had a good client, but he wasn't able to persuade his funders to invest in this because they thought that 5 years was too long as a payback period. And that's the tragedy often, that we're able to design fantastic solutions that will be much better and much cheaper in the long run. But because we've got used to very short-term economics, we're told, well, those don't make economic sense. Well, they only don't make economic sense because you're discounting the impact of this on our kids and future generations. And it's not even a case of generations in 50 years' time, as we saw earlier this week with the extreme heat and fires. This is very real now. It's having a massive impact on people's lives.
Would you find yourself in your role, and obviously you're fascinated by ideas and creating all these things of years, in a way reactive, just making things find solutions to problems? Or now you find yourself, you have to be more proactive, you'll feel like going to 10 Downing Street and banging on the door, say, look, we've got to get on with this. Do you find even like I said, your role itself changing?
Yeah, absolutely. And I've become a reluctant activist, actually. And I say reluctant activist because, I'd be happier just designing clever things inspired by nature that are better for people and the planet and so on. But it became clear to me in 2018 when the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change issued their October report in 2018, became clear that we were nowhere near on track to secure a safe future. And so that's when I started writing this book with Sarah, and I also jointly initiated something called Architects Declare a Climate and Biodiversity Emergency. And that was with a friend of mine called Steve Tompkins, and we then expanded that. So we launched that in May 2019 with a leading group of big architectural practices. And then the numbers expanded way faster than we thought, and it's now expanded to 28 countries. So we've got over 7,000 companies signed up to a declaration of action. And on top of that, we're trying to use that to bring about systems change at a governmental level. We're going to government, we're saying that we have a lot of the solutions, and here's what we need you to play your part. And actually, we do need high-level systems change. We're not going to achieve this just through, conscious consumerism, buying the right washing powder or whatever. We need the courage to make bigger changes than that.
Brilliant. Well, thanks for that, Michael. That's a really brilliant, inspiring interview.